The room froze the moment my brother's smug voice echoed through the church hall. Mourners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, stunned by his bold declaration. He had just announced, with the arrogance of a man convinced of victory, that grandmother's entire estate, including the piano she had cherished her whole life, belonged to him alone. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Heart pounded, but I remained calm. Slowly I stood, walked toward the lawyer with measured steps, and handed him a sealed envelope I had guarded for weeks. Leaning close, I whispered, "Read the real document." As he opened it, his hands shook, his voice cracked, and the entire room turned against my brother as the truth was finally revealed. The day my grandmother taught me to play Moonlight Sonata was the day I understood what legacy truly meant. Her fingers, weathered but graceful, guided mine across ivory keys that had known 3 generations of our family. Outside the bay windows of her Nashville home, autumn painted the maple trees in fiery oranges and deep reds, a backdrop to our afternoon ritual. "Emily," she said, her southern accent gentle but firm, "music isn't just about hitting the right notes. It's about feeling them in your bones." I was 26 then, already settled into my position as an associate professor of American literature at Vanderbilt University. But in her presence, I always felt like the wide-eyed 8-year-old who had first sat on that piano bench. Grandmother Olivia Parker was 79, with silver hair always perfectly coiffed, her posture as straight as the day she'd performed with the Nashville Symphony decades ago. The piano, a 1920s Steinway with carved mahogany details, had been her mother's before her. "Your brother never understood this," she added quietly, her blue eyes clouding slightly. "Nathaniel sees value in what can be sold, not in what should be cherished." I nodded, knowing all too well what she meant. My older brother had always been the family's golden child on paper, handsome, charismatic, successful in real estate. But beneath the polished exterior lay a calculation that had always unsettled me. "He called again," she continued, her fingers stilling on the keys. "Asked about my will. 3rd time this month." A familiar knot formed in my stomach. "What did you tell him?" "I told him what he wanted to hear," she smiled, a hint of mischief dancing in her eyes. "Sometimes, Emily, silence speaks volumes, but other times, a carefully chosen word speaks more." It was the last lesson she ever taught me at that piano. 3 weeks later, she was hospitalized with pneumonia. The infection that took hold of her lungs worked quickly, giving us little time to prepare for what was coming. During her final days, family members filtered through her hospital room, cousins, aunts, distant relatives who hadn't visited in years but suddenly appeared, concern etched on their faces. Nathaniel was conspicuously absent until the doctors mentioned final arrangements. He arrived in an expensive suit, his Rolex flashing as he gestured, immediately taking charge of discussions with doctors and the family. Lawyer, Daniel Harris, who had served our family for decades. I spent those nights by her bedside, reading her favorite Steinbeck novels aloud while monitors beeped softly in the background. On her final night, while the hospital corridor was quiet and visiting hours long over, her eyes opened with startling clarity. "Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Bottom drawer of my writing desk. The blue envelope." I leaned closer, her perfume, lavender and vanilla, still somehow present despite the sterile hospital smells. "The real will," she continued. "Keep it safe. When the time comes, you'll know." Her grip on my hand tightened momentarily, surprising strength from someone so diminished by illness. "Promise me." "I promise," I whispered back. She smiled, satisfied, and closed her eyes. By morning, she was gone. The days that followed passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and shared casseroles from well-meaning neighbors. Nathaniel took control immediately, speaking with the funeral home, selecting an expensive mahogany casket. "Only the best for Mother," he declared loudly when relatives were within earshot, and consulting with Daniel Harris about the estate matters. I drove to grandmother's house the day after she passed, the gravel driveway crunching beneath my tires. The autumn trees stood silent sentinels as I approached the Victorian home that had been in our family for generations. I used my key, entering through the kitchen door as I always had. The house felt different, emptier, as though it already knew its mistress wouldn't return. The writing desk sat in her study, a beautiful cherrywood piece with delicate inlaid mother-of-pearl detailing. I opened the bottom drawer with trembling hands. There, beneath stationery and old photographs, lay a pale blue envelope sealed with wax impressed with her monogram, OEP, Olivia Elizabeth Parker. I slipped it into my bag, not daring to open it. Whatever grandmother had entrusted to me, I would honor her wishes. The next morning, Nathaniel called. "I'm having the piano appraised tomorrow," he said without preamble. "Christie's thinks it might fetch upwards of 80,000. My throat tightened. "The piano isn't for sale, Nate." His laugh was dismissive. "Of course it is. Everything is. Mother left everything to me. The house, the land, the furnishings. Daniel's already shown me the preliminary paperwork." "What preliminary paperwork?" I asked, my voice steady despite the anger rising within me. "The draft of her will from last year. It's all coming to me as the eldest. It's the sensible choice. You've got your academic career, your little apartment. What would you do with an estate this size? Besides," his voice took on the patronizing tone I'd heard since childhood, "I promised Mother I'd take care of everything." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the blue envelope. I didn't open it. Something told me that grandmother's timing had always been impeccable, and this would be no different. The funeral was set for Saturday at First Presbyterian, where grandmother had played organ for 20 years. The church filled quickly. Colleagues from her teaching days, former piano students, neighbors, and family from across Tennessee and beyond. I sat in the front pew, dressed in a simple black dress and the pearl earrings she had given me for my college graduation. Nathaniel sat beside me, his arm draped over his wife Melissa's shoulders, occasionally checking his phone. The service was beautiful. Hymns grandmother had loved, scripture readings that spoke of eternity and peace. At the conclusion, Daniel Harris stood to make a few remarks before the reception. "Olivia Parker's will shall be formally read at my office on Monday," he announced, his voice resonant in the vaulted space. However, as per family tradition, that was when Nathaniel stood, straightening his Italian suit jacket. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he gazed around the assembled mourners. "If I may," he interrupted, stepping forward. "As Mother's son and primary caretaker in her final years, I can share what we've already discussed with the family attorney." Daniel Harris's eyebrows rose slightly, but he stepped back, clearly caught off guard. "My mother's will," Nathaniel continued, his voice carrying with practiced confidence, "leaves her entire estate to me, including the piano that meant so much to her. I'll be preserving her legacy by ensuring these assets are properly managed." A murmur rippled through the church. I saw Aunt Margaret's hand fly to her mouth in surprise. Uncle Robert's face darken with suspicion. My cousin Sarah caught my eye from across the aisle, her expression questioning. The blue envelope seemed to burn through my purse. Grandmother's words echoed. "When the time comes, you'll know." This was the time. I stood slowly, my heart pounding, but my steps measured as I approached Daniel Harris. The church fell silent as I reached into my purse and withdrew the blue envelope. I handed it to him, leaning close to whisper, "Read the real document." Daniel Harris stared at the blue envelope, recognition flashing across his face. His fingers traced the wax seal, grandmother's distinctive monogram that he had witnessed countless times during their 40 years of professional association. "This is Olivia Parker's personal seal," he announced, his voice carrying through the hushed church. He looked at me, then at Nathaniel, whose confident smile began to falter. "I believe we should proceed with caution here." "What is this?" Nathaniel hissed, stepping toward me. "What are you trying to pull, Emily?" "Mrs. Parker gave me explicit instructions to open this document only in the presence of the assembled family after her funeral," Daniel said, breaking the seal carefully. The crisp sound of the wax splitting seemed unnaturally loud in the silent church. I returned to my seat, meeting Nathaniel's glare with a calmness I didn't entirely feel. His face had flushed red, a vein pulsing at his temple, the same tell he'd had since childhood when his plans were threatened. Daniel unfolded several pages of thick stationery, grandmother's elegant handwriting immediately recognizable. He cleared his throat and began to read. "Being of sound mind and body, I, Olivia Elizabeth Parker, hereby revoke all previous wills and testaments. This document represents my final wishes, signed and notarized on April 17th of this year." Daniel glanced up briefly. That date was just 2 months before her hospitalization, far more recent than the preliminary paperwork Nathaniel had mentioned. "To my beloved granddaughter, Emily Parker, I leave my Steinway piano, along with all my music compositions, books, and the sum of $100,000. Emily understood that music isn't about possession, but about passing on a legacy of beauty. I felt tears prick behind my eyes, but blinked them back. Nathaniel shifted beside me, his breathing growing heavier. To the Nashville Children's Hospital Music Therapy Program, I leave the sum of $200,000 to establish the Olivia Parker Memorial Fund for Healing Through Music. Daniel continued reading through several smaller bequests, jewelry to cousins, books to former colleagues, charitable donations. Then he paused, adjusting his glasses before continuing. Regarding my home and remaining estate, the property at 1847 Magnolia Avenue, including all furnishings not otherwise specified, and the remainder of my financial assets, shall be placed in the Parker Family Trust, to be administered by my attorney, Daniel Harris, with my granddaughter Emily Parker serving as trustee. Nathaniel stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. Mother would never— I make this decision, Daniel continued, raising his voice slightly, with full awareness that my son Nathaniel will be disappointed. However, his actions have demonstrated that his interest in my estate has been primarily financial rather than sentimental. A shocked murmur ran through the congregation. I saw Melissa's hand tighten on Nathaniel's arm, trying to pull him back to his seat, but he shook her off. Specifically, Daniel read, his voice growing more confident, I referenced the incident of January last year, when Nathaniel attempted to have me declared mentally incompetent after I refused to sign property over to him, as well as his unauthorized attempt to list my home with his real estate company without my knowledge or consent. Gasps echoed through the church. Aunt Margaret covered her mouth in shock, while Uncle Robert's expression hardened into disgust as he looked at my brother. This is slander, Nathaniel shouted, his composure cracking completely. She was confused in her final months. Emily manipulated her. Daniel held up his hand. The document continues. To prevent any claims of undue influence, I have video recorded my statement of these wishes, witnessed by Dr. Caroline Fletcher and Reverend Thomas Wilkins, neither of whom are beneficiaries. This recording is stored with the original copy of this will in Daniel Harris's office safe. Grandmother had thought of everything. I remembered Dr. Fletcher visiting last spring, grandmother's oldest friend and a respected neurologist. Reverend Wilkins had been her pastor for 20 years. Both were sitting in the congregation now, their expressions solemn but unsurprised. Finally, Daniel read, to my son Nathaniel, I leave the sum of $10,000 and my sincere hope that he will one day understand that true wealth is not measured in possessions, but in how we care for one another. I have loved him always, even when I could not approve of his choices. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the church had turned to Nathaniel, whose face had drained of all color. He stood frozen, trapped between rage and humiliation. You planned this? He finally snarled at me, loud enough for everyone to hear. You turned her against me. Nathaniel, I said quietly. She knew what you were doing. She always did. Daniel folded the will deliberately. The document is properly signed and notarized. I can confirm its authenticity, as I witnessed Mrs. Parker's signature myself, though she asked me not to disclose its contents until this moment. Whispers rippled through the church as the full impact of what had happened settled over the congregation. Nathaniel looked around wildly, seeing formerly sympathetic faces now regarding him with shock and disappointment. This isn't over, he growled, grabbing his coat. I'll contest it. I'll sue you, Emily. I'll sue everyone involved in this charade. He stormed down the aisle, Melissa hurrying after him, her high heels clicking on the marble floor. The heavy wooden doors slammed behind them, the sound reverberating through the sacred space. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, Aunt Margaret came to sit beside me, taking my hand in hers. Uncle Robert followed, then cousins, neighbors, and friends, a circle of support forming around me as Daniel Harris carefully returned the will to its envelope. Olivia asked me to give you this as well, he said quietly, handing me a smaller envelope that had been inside the larger one. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of grandmother's personal stationery, her elegant script flowing across the page. My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, then you've honored my final request. I'm sorry to have placed this burden on you, but I knew you had the strength to bear it. Nathaniel has always chosen the path of least resistance, taking what he wanted without regard for others. He saw the piano only as an object of value, never understanding the music that gives it life. You, my dear girl, have always heard the music, not just in the piano, but in the world around you. The trust I've established isn't about denying Nathaniel his inheritance. It's about ensuring that what I valued most, education, music, community, continues to thrive. As trustee, you'll have the wisdom to guide these resources toward helping others find their own music. Remember what I taught you. Notes on a page are just possibilities until someone brings them to life with love and understanding. The same is true of wealth, of property, of all we leave behind. With all my love, Grandmother. I folded the letter carefully, holding it against my heart as the pastor stepped forward to conclude the service. The pipe organ began to play softly. Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, Grandmother's favorite. As we filed out of the church into the golden autumn afternoon, I felt a strange mixture of grief and peace. The confrontation I had dreaded was over, but the real work of honoring Grandmother's legacy was just beginning. That evening, as friends and family gathered at Grandmother's home, now the center of the trust she had established, I slipped away to the music room. The Steinway stood in its place of honor by the windows, bathed in the amber light of sunset. I sat down at the bench, my fingers finding their place on the familiar keys. The first notes of Moonlight Sonata filled the room, hesitant at first, then growing in confidence. As I played, I thought of Grandmother's words. Music isn't just about hitting the right notes. It's about feeling them in your bones. I felt her presence then, not as a ghost, but as a continuation, the music she had taught me becoming a bridge between what was lost and what remained. Outside the window, the maple trees swayed slightly in the evening breeze, their autumn colors deepening as the day faded to dusk. Behind me, I heard the door open softly. Several relatives had gathered in the doorway, drawn by the music. They listened silently, respecting the moment, understanding finally what Grandmother had always known, that some legacies can't be measured in dollar signs or square footage. Some legacies resonate in the heart, passed from one generation to the next like a melody that never truly ends. The Monday following the funeral dawned with a clarity that seemed almost cruel. Nashville's October sky an impossible blue against the changing leaves. I drove to Daniel Harris's downtown office for the official reading of the will, my hands steady on the wheel despite the knot in my stomach. I knew Nathaniel would be there. I also knew he wouldn't surrender easily. The law offices of Harris and Associates occupied the 7th floor of a modern glass building that stood in stark contrast to the historic courthouse across the street. When I arrived, Daniel's assistant, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, ushered me into a conference room, with a view of the Cumberland River. "Mr. Harris will be with you shortly," she said, setting a carafe of water on the polished oak table. "Can I get you anything else while you wait?" I shook my head, thanking her. The room was empty, but 5 chairs had been arranged around the table. I chose one facing the door and waited, watching the minutes tick by on an antique grandfather clock in the Tewa corner. At precisely 10 o'clock, the door opened. Daniel entered first, followed by Dr. Fletcher and Reverend Wilkins, the witnesses Grandmother had chosen. They nodded solemnly to me as they took their seats. "No, Nathaniel." "Should we wait?" I asked, glancing at the empty chair. Daniel consulted his watch. "We'll give him 5 more minutes. I did receive a call from his attorney this morning. Gerald Winston from Blackwell and Winston." My heart sank. Blackwell and Winston was one of Nashville's most aggressive estate litigation firms, so Nathaniel was making good on his threat. At 10:07, the door opened again. Nathaniel walked in, followed by a sharp-featured man in an impeccably tailored suit. My brother didn't meet my eyes as he took the seat furthest from mine. "Now that we're all present," Daniel began, "I'll proceed with the formal reading of Olivia Parker's last will and testament, which I've already summarized at the service on Saturday. For the record, I am also acknowledging the presence of Gerald Winston, representing Nathaniel Parker." The attorney pulled out a slim recorder. "I'll be documenting this meeting," he said, his voice clipped. Daniel nodded, unsurprised, and began reading the will in its entirety. The formal legal language was more extensive than what he'd shared at the church, but the substance remained unchanged. When he finished, he looked up. "Are there any questions before I discuss next steps regarding the trust administration?" "Yes," Winston interjected immediately. "My client contests this will on grounds of undue influence and questions Mrs. Parker's mental capacity at the time of signing." Dr. Fletcher raised an eyebrow. "As Olivia's physician for over 20 years and a board-certified neurologist, I can categorically state that she was of sound mind when she executed this will. My examination notes from that day will confirm this. And as her pastor," Reverend Wilkins added quietly, "I can attest to Olivia's clarity of purpose, and her detailed explanation of her decisions. Winston remained unmoved. Nevertheless, we'll be filing formal objections this afternoon and requesting temporary injunctive relief to prevent any transfer of assets until this matter is resolved. Daniel's expression remained professional, but I could see the slight tightening around his eyes. That is your right, of course. However, I should inform you that Mrs. Parker anticipated this possibility. He withdrew another document from his folder. This is a letter she directed me to provide to Nathaniel in the event of a challenge. He slid the sealed envelope across the table. Nathaniel stared at it, making no move to pick it up. "What's in it?" he asked, his voice lacking the confidence it had carried at the funeral. "I don't know," Daniel replied honestly. "Olivia sealed it after writing it. She only asked me to deliver it to you if you contested her will." Winston reached for the letter, but Daniel gently pulled it back. "It's addressed to Nathaniel personally, not his legal representation." After a moment's hesitation, Nathaniel took the envelope, breaking the seal with a quick, angry motion. As he read, the color drained from his face. Without a word, he handed it to his attorney, then stood abruptly. "We need to confer," Winston said, guiding my brother from the room. In the silence that followed, I looked questioningly at Daniel. "I truly don't know what she wrote," he said softly. "Olivia had her secrets, even from me." We waited almost 15 minutes before the door opened again. Nathaniel returned alone, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Winston had another appointment," he said stiffly. "I've decided not to contest the will after all." I couldn't hide my surprise. "Just like that?" His laugh was brittle. "Believe me, it's not from any sense of family loyalty. Mother simply left me no choice." He straightened his tie, a nervous gesture I recognized from childhood. "The trust. Paperwork. I assume you'll need my signature on some things?" Daniel nodded, clearly as surprised as I was by this sudden capitulation. "Yes, there are several forms acknowledging the transfer of assets." "Fine. Let's get it over with." The next hour passed in a blur of signatures and notarizations. Nathaniel remained cold but cooperative, signing each document without reading it, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. When the last form was complete, he stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Emily," he said, finally meeting my gaze, "don't call me. Don't contact me. As far as I'm concerned, you're no longer family." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "I hope the piano brings you joy. God knows it's all you're getting from me." The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow felt more final than a slam. Dr. Fletcher reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Don't take it to heart, dear. Nathaniel has always been his own worst enemy." "What do you think was in that letter?" I asked, looking at Daniel. He shook his head. "Whatever it was effective. I've never seen a contested will withdrawn so quickly." We concluded our business shortly after. As trustee, I would be working closely with Daniel in the coming months to establish the programs grandmother had outlined: the Children's Hospital, the music scholarships, the Community Arts Initiative, a legacy that would touch far more lives than just our families. That evening, I returned to grandmother's house, now the trust's principal asset, and wandered through rooms that felt both familiar and strange. In the study, I noticed something I'd missed before: a small brass key taped to the underside of her desk blotter, with a note in her handwriting. "Storage room, back cabinet." The storage room was off the kitchen, a walk-in pantry that had been converted to hold household items. At the back, a tall wooden cabinet stood against the wall. The key fit perfectly. Inside, I found a stack of leather-bound journals, decades of my grandmother's diaries, dating back to her 20s. Beneath them lay a manila folder labeled simply, "Nathaniel Evidence." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were bank statements, forged signatures, letters from attorneys, a meticulous documentation of my brother's attempts to gain control of her assets over the years. And most damning of all, a USB drive labeled "Nathaniel attempting to have me declared incompetent," recorded conversation with Dr. Hathaway January 14th. I returned everything to the cabinet and locked it, understanding now why Nathaniel had backed down so quickly. Grandmother hadn't been just protecting her legacy, she'd been protecting herself from him for years. As I walked back through the quiet house, the reality of my new responsibility settled over me. This wasn't just about a piano or an inheritance. It was about honoring the truth, complicated and painful though it might be, and building something meaningful from it. I sat at the Steinway, my fingers finding a melody I'd composed years ago but never finished. The notes echoed through the empty rooms, a conversation with the past, and a question to the future. Outside, night had fallen completely, but through the window, I could see stars emerging one by one in the Nashville sky, each a small point of clarity in the darkness. 3 weeks after the funeral, I submitted my request for a sabbatical from Vanderbilt. My department chair, understanding the circumstances, approved it immediately. 1 semester to establish the trust and settle grandmother's affairs. I would return to teaching in the spring, but for now, my focus needed to be elsewhere. October gave way to November, bringing shorter days and chilly mornings that frosted the windows of grandmother's house. I'd been staying there most nights, feeling a responsibility to the place that went beyond mere ownership. One evening, while sorting through her extensive book collection, I discovered a business card tucked into her copy of Great Expectations, James Sullivan, Architectural Preservation. The next day, I called the number. Sullivan Preservation, answered a warm female voice. This is Rachel. Hello, I'm Emily Parker. I found your card in my grandmother's book. Olivia Parker? I believe she may have consulted with Mr. Sullivan at some point. There was a pause, then recognition. Ms. Parker. Yes, of course. James was working with your grandmother on getting her home listed on the National Register of Historic Places. He was so sorry to hear of her passing. This was news to me. She was trying to get the house historically designated? Oh yes, quite passionately. The property is one of the few remaining examples of Victorian Italianate architecture in Nashville that hasn't been significantly altered. James had completed most of the research and documentation. They were just waiting for the final approval before she fell ill. I felt a surge of emotion. Another piece of grandmother I hadn't known. Another layer to her planning. Is it still possible to continue the application? Absolutely. James would be happy to speak with you about it. He's with clients today, but I can schedule you for tomorrow morning. The next day, I met James Sullivan at a coffee shop near Centennial Park. He was younger than I'd expected, perhaps early 40s, with prematurely silver hair and intelligent eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses. He spread a folder of documents across the table between us. Your grandmother was remarkable, he said, flipping through architectural drawings and historical photographs. Most people her age would have been tempted to sell to developers. The land alone is worth millions. But Olivia was determined to preserve not just the building, but its purpose. Its purpose? He nodded. The house was originally built by your great-great-grandfather as a place for community gatherings, musical performances, lectures. It was only later that it became solely a residence. Olivia wanted to restore that original intention, a place where people could come together around culture and ideas. I thought of the trust, the programs grandmother had established, the careful way she had structured her legacy. Everything connected. We were about 2 weeks away from submitting the final application when she went into the hospital, James continued. If you're interested in proceeding, we could have everything ready by the end of the month. Yes, I said, without hesitation. That's exactly what I want to do. As November progressed, I divided my time between trust administration with Daniel Harris, historical preservation work with James Sullivan, and my own process of going through grandmother's personal effects. Each day brought new discoveries, letters from famous musicians who had visited the house, photographs of civil rights activists meeting in the parlor in the 1960s, architectural details I'd never noticed despite a lifetime of visits. And then there was the music room. I spent every evening at the piano, sometimes playing grandmother's favorites, sometimes my own compositions. The Steinway became my confidant, my connection to a past I was only beginning to fully understand. One snowy evening in early December, as I was practicing a particularly difficult passage of Chopin, the doorbell rang. Curious, I wasn't expecting visitors. I made my way to the front entrance, switching on porch lights that illuminated falling snowflakes. Melissa stood on the doorstep, her blonde hair dusted in with white, her expression uncertain. Melissa, I said, surprised. I hadn't seen Nathaniel's wife since the funeral. Come in, please, it's freezing out there. She stepped inside, unwinding a cashmere scarf from her neck. I shouldn't be here, she said quietly. Nate would be furious if he knew. I led her to the kitchen, putting on a kettle for tea. Is everything all right? She laughed, a hollow sound. No, not really. Nate's been difficult since the funeral. Drinking too much. The real estate business is struggling. He fired his assistant last week for disloyalty, which meant she suggested he consider a client's counteroffer. She accepted the mug of tea I offered. But that's not why I'm here. From her designer handbag, she withdrew an envelope. I found this when I was cleaning out Nate's home office. It was hidden behind the bookshelf. I think you should have it. Inside was a letter in grandmother's handwriting, dated just 6 months before her death. Unlike her final letter to me, this one was filled with pain and disappointment. She described discovering Nathaniel's attempt to have her declared incompetent, his forging of her signature on property documents, his secret meetings with less scrupulous attorneys. I always suspected, I said, folding the letter carefully. But seeing it written out like this? There's more, Melissa said, her voice dropping. He's been calling people from the funeral, telling them you manipulated your grandmother, that you're mismanaging the trust. He's trying to salvage his reputation by destroying yours. I absorbed this information, surprised to find I wasn't angry, just sad. Why are you telling me this? Why give me the letter? She stared into her tea for a long moment. Because Olivia was always kind to me, even when she saw through Nate's charm. And because, she hesitated, I'm filing for divorce. I can't live with his bitterness anymore. I thought you should know what you're dealing with. After Melissa left, I returned to the music room, the letter tucked safely away in grandmother's desk. Outside, snow continued to fall, muffling the city sounds, creating a pocket of silence around the old house. I sat at the piano but didn't play, thinking instead about the ties that bound our family, some strengthening over time, others unraveling completely. The Steinway gleamed in the soft lamplight, its polished surface reflecting the room around it. I ran my fingers lightly over the keys, remembering grandmother's words from so long ago. Music isn't just about hitting the right notes. It's about feeling them in your bones. I understood now what she'd meant. About music, about family, about legacy. Some harmonies couldn't be forced. Some discordant notes couldn't be resolved. But the melody continued nonetheless, changing and evolving, finding its way forward. Outside my window, Nashville slept beneath its blanket of snow, and inside, surrounded by the ghosts of 4 generations, I began to play. January arrived with a biting cold that seemed to seep through Nashville's historic buildings, sending residents scurrying between heated cars and warm interiors. I'd settled into a routine at grandmother's house, splitting my time between trust administration, preservation work, and preparation for my return to teaching. The historic designation application had been submitted just before Christmas, with James Sullivan assuring me we had a strong case. My phone rang one morning as I was cataloging grandmother's extensive sheet music collection. Emily Parker, this is Kenneth Williams from the Tennessean. I'm hoping to speak with you about the Parker Trust and the historic status application for your grandmother's property. My pulse quickened. How can I help you, Mr. Williams? I'm working on a feature about Nashville's architectural preservation efforts, and your grandmother's home has an interesting history. I understand there's also a significant community arts component to the trust she established. We arranged to meet that afternoon. I spent the intervening hours reviewing trust documents with Daniel's help, wanting to be precise about grandmother's vision. Something about the timing of the call nagged at me. It seemed too coincidental after Melissa's warning about Nathaniel's campaign against me. Kenneth Williams turned out to be a thoughtful journalist in his 50s with a notebook full of detailed questions. We sat in grandmother's parlor, where winter sunlight streamed through leaded glass windows, casting prismatic patterns across the hardwood floors. This house has witnessed quite a bit of Nashville history, he observed, looking around appreciatively. 4 generations of it, I agreed. My great-great-grandfather built it in 1887. He was a music publisher who wanted a space where artists could gather and perform. Williams scribbled notes as I explained grandmother's plan to restore that original purpose through the trust, establishing music scholarships, hosting community concerts, partnering with local schools for arts education, and the historic designation will help protect the property from development pressures. Exactly. This neighborhood has seen so many beautiful old homes torn down for condominiums. Grandmother wanted to ensure this place remained accessible to the community. He nodded, then shifted in his seat slightly. I should mention, I've been contacted by someone suggesting there are irregularities with the trust establishment, that perhaps your grandmother wasn't of sound mind when she made these arrangements. There it was. Nathaniel's influence. I met his eyes steadily. My grandmother's mental capacity was verified by her longtime physician, who is a neurologist, and witnessed by her pastor of 20 years. The will has been validated in probate court, and all legal challenges have been withdrawn. I retrieved the folder of documentation I'd prepared. The neurologist's statement, the witness affidavits, the court determination, even a copy of the video recording grandmother had made. All public records now. I appreciate your transparency, Williams said, reviewing the materials. One more question. Your brother was originally under the impression he would inherit the estate. What changed your grandmother's mind? I chose my words carefully. My grandmother valued family legacy, but she valued integrity more. She made her decisions based on who she believed would honor her wishes and serve the community she loved. After Williams left, I sat in the quiet parlor, wondering how Nathaniel would react when the article appeared. I didn't have to wait long to find out. The feature ran 3 days later, a full-page spread titled Preserving Nashville's Soul, the Parker Legacy. The article was thoughtful and balanced, focusing on grandmother's vision and the historical significance of the property. My brother wasn't mentioned by name, though there was a brief acknowledgement of initial confusion regarding inheritance plans. That evening, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Nathaniel standing on the porch, his face flushed. With anger or cold? Perhaps both. For a moment, I considered not answering, but that seemed cowardly. I opened the door but blocked the entrance. Nathaniel, nice article, he spat. Did you enjoy painting yourself as the dutiful granddaughter while making me look like a money-grubbing villain? You weren't even mentioned in the article. Don't play innocent. Initial confusion about inheritance? Everyone who was at that funeral knows exactly who that refers to. He tried to step inside, but I held my ground. Are you really not going to let me in? This was my home too. What do you want, Nate? He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it almost softened my resolve. I want what's mine. Mother would never have cut me out like this if you hadn't poisoned her. Against me. She knew what you were doing, I said quietly. The forged signatures, the attempt to have her declared incompetent. She documented everything. His expression flickered. Those were misunderstandings. I was trying to protect her assets. From whom? She was perfectly capable of managing her own affairs. She was nearly 80. His voice rose. She was making irrational decisions, giving away money to every charity that asked, talking about turning this house into some kind of community center. Someone had to be practical. That wasn't your decision to make. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. You have no idea what I sacrificed for this family while you were off playing professor. Who do you think managed her investments? Arranged for house repairs? Dealt with the accountants and the insurance? And now you're paid for those services. $10,000 as specified in her will. It was cruel, perhaps, but effective. He recoiled as if I'd slapped him. This isn't over, Emily. The trust can be challenged. The historic designation can be contested. You think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming. After he left, I locked the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding. Despite everything, he was still my brother. We'd built sandcastles together as children, argued over board games, shared childhood secrets. Now we were strangers, separated by a gulf of mistrust that seemed impossible to bridge. I returned to the music room, drawn to the Steinway as I always was in moments of distress. As I began to play Debussy piece that had always calmed me, I noticed a small envelope that had been slipped beneath the piano bench. Inside was a key and a note in Melissa's handwriting. Storage Unit NAR 47, Nashville Security Storage, Commerce Street. More evidence. Be careful. The next morning, I drove to the storage facility, a modern building with climate-controlled units. Unit number 47 contained a single filings cabinet. Using Melissa's key, I unlocked it to find neat rows of folders, each meticulously labeled in grandmother's handwriting. Nathaniel, financial irregularities, attempted power of attorney transfer, forged checks, and most disturbing of all, threats, recorded calls. I borrowed a friend's laptop and listened to the recordings. Nathaniel's voice, slightly slurred from alcohol, leaving increasingly hostile messages on grandmother's answering machine. The timestamps showed they'd been recorded in the months before she changed her will. You stubborn old woman, what do you know how easy it would be to have you committed? One call about your confusion and paranoia. I'm the only one looking out for this family's interests. I couldn't finish listening. These weren't just the ravings of a greedy son. They bordered on elder abuse. Grandmother had been protecting herself, not just her legacy. I called Daniel Harris immediately. We need to secure these documents, he said after I explained what I'd found. They may be necessary if Nathaniel pursues further legal action. And Emily, you might consider a restraining order given his behavior last night. He's my brother, I protested weakly. He's also a man who's lost a great deal and blames you for it. That's a dangerous combination. I transported the files to Daniel's office that afternoon. As I drove back through Nashville's busy streets, I found myself wondering what grandmother would advise. She had loved Nathaniel despite everything. That was clear from her will, from the sadness that permeated her private writings about him. Yet she'd also taken decisive action to protect herself and her wishes. Back at the house, I found James Sullivan waiting on the porch with unexpected news. "We've received preliminary approval for the historic designation," he said, his face alight with professional satisfaction. "It's happening much faster than usual. Someone at the commission must be expediting our application." "That's wonderful," I said, inviting him in from the cold. Over tea in the kitchen, he spread out the preliminary approval documents. "Once this is finalized, any significant alterations to the property will require commission approval. It provides an important layer of protection. Against developers? Against anyone who might want to change the essential character of the house." He didn't say against Nathaniel, but we both knew what he meant. James lingered after our business was concluded, our conversation shifting from preservation to literature. He had a surprising knowledge of American modernism, then to music. I found myself enjoying his company, his thoughtful questions, his evident passion for history, the way he listened as if each answer mattered. "Do you play?" I asked, noticing his gaze drift toward the music room. "Poorly," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. 12 years of lessons, and I still massacre anything more complicated than Fur-Elise. Would you like to see the Steinway? It's quite remarkable. Built in 1923 and still has its original soundboard. In the music room, the afternoon sun had faded, leaving the space in a gentle twilight. I switched on a single lamp that cast a warm glow over the instrument. James approached it with the reverence of someone who understood its value, not just in dollars, but in history. "This is extraordinary craftsmanship," he said, running his fingers lightly along its edge. "May I?" I nodded, and he sat at the bench, playing a few tentative chords. "See? Dreadful." "Not at all." I laughed, the sound surprising me. When had I last laughed genuinely? "You just need to feel it, not just play it." I sat beside him, our shoulders almost touching, and began a simple duet I had taught many times before. His part was elementary, repeating bass notes that anchored the melody I played with my right hand. Together, the notes intertwined into something unexpected and lovely. "There," I said as we finished. "You just made music." He turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "I think you did all the heavy lifting there." "That's not how music works. Each part matters." Outside, dusk had fallen completely, Nashville's lights beginning to twinkle across the winter landscape. For the first time since grandmother's death, I felt something uncoil inside me. Not happiness exactly, but possibility. February brought slightly warmer days, but turbulent weather. Sunshine giving way to thunderstorms with little warning, mirroring the unpredictable rhythms of my life. My sabbatical was halfway complete, and I was simultaneously preparing to return to teaching, overseeing the first trust disbursements, and working with James on the final historic designation paperwork. I'd seen nothing of Nathaniel since his angry visit, though Melissa called occasionally with updates. He had lost 2 major clients, was drinking more heavily, and had begun speaking openly about contesting the will despite his earlier withdrawal. "He's fixated on the piano," she told me during one such call. "Says it's the only thing that matters anymore, that Mother always promised it to him." This was news to me. Grandmother explicitly left the piano to me in her will. "I know, but Nate claims there was an earlier verbal agreement. He's convinced himself it's true." Melissa sighed. "I've moved out, by the way. Filed the divorce papers last week." He didn't even seem surprised. I was returning from campus one afternoon, having met with my department chair to discuss the courses I'd be teaching in the spring, when I noticed an unfamiliar car parked across from grandmother's house. As I pulled into the driveway, a woman emerged from it, elegantly dressed, perhaps in her 60s, with a portfolio case under her arm. "Ms. Parker?" she called, approaching. "I'm Victoria Chamberlain from Sotheby's. Your brother arranged for me to appraise the Steinway today." I stared at her, momentarily speechless. "I'm sorry, but there must be a mistake. The piano isn't for sale. It was specifically bequeathed to me in my grandmother's will." Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose slightly. Mr. Parker indicated he had joint ownership. He scheduled this appraisal last week. "He has no ownership whatsoever," I said firmly, "and no right to schedule anything regarding this property or its contents." She looked embarrassed. "I see. I apologize for the confusion." She handed me her card. "If you do ever consider selling, the instrument would generate significant interest among our clients." Steinways of that period, especially with documented provenance, are highly sought after. After she left, I called Daniel immediately. "This is harassment," he said. "We should file for a cease and desist order." "Let me try talking to him one more time," I said. "He's still my brother." Daniel's silence conveyed his skepticism, but he agreed to hold off on legal action while I made one last attempt at reconciliation. I called Nathaniel that evening, half expecting him to ignore me, but he answered on the second ring. "I wondered how long it would take you to call after my little surprise," he said, his tone now mockingly pleasant. "You can't send appraisers to the house, Nate. You have no legal right to sell anything here, especially not the piano. Don't I? Mother promised that piano to me long before she got sick, before you started manipulating her. Any court would recognize a prior verbal agreement. That's not true, and you know it. She always intended the piano for me." He laughed. "Because you're the musician, the sensitive one, the good granddaughter? Save it, Emily. I've heard it all my life." I took a deep breath, trying a different approach. "Nate, what's really going on? This isn't like you, isn't it? You've always seen me as the villain, so why stop now?" "That's not fair. We were close once." There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its brittle edge. "The business is failing. I've lost clients. My marriage is over. Everything's falling apart, and it started with that damn will reading." For a moment, I felt a flash of sympathy. Then I remembered the recordings, the threatening messages he'd left for grandmother. "I'm sorry things are difficult, but that doesn't give you the right to harass me or try to claim what isn't yours." "So righteous," he sneered, the momentary vulnerability vanishing. "You know what? Keep the piano. Keep all of it. But don't think this is over." He hung up before I could respond. I sat in the darkened kitchen, the old house creaking around me, wondering if there had ever been a chance to heal this rift, or if we had been moving toward this breaking point our entire lives. The next day was Saturday. I spent the morning working on trust business, sorting through applications for the first round of music scholarships. Grandmother had been specific about the criteria: students with financial need, demonstrated talent, and a commitment to community service. Reading through their personal statements, stories of determination, of music as salvation, of dreams that extended beyond themselves, I felt the rightness of her vision. Around noon, the doorbell rang. James Sullivan stood on the porch, a folder tucked under his arm. "I was in the neighborhood," he said. "Thought I'd drop off the final designation paperwork for your review before we submit it on Monday." I invited him in, sensing he had more than paperwork on his mind. We had been meeting regularly over the past weeks, our conversations stretching beyond professional matters into personal territories. I had learned about his divorce 3 years earlier, his teenage daughter who shared his love of history, his quiet passion for architectural preservation that went beyond mere professional interest. "Everything all right?" he asked as I made coffee. "You seem preoccupied." I told him about Nathaniel's latest attempt and our subsequent conversation. "Family conflicts around inheritance are always the hardest," he said. "The emotions run so deep, and it's never really about the objects themselves." "What do you mean?" He considered for a moment. "In my experience, when people fight this fiercely over possessions, they're really fighting over what those possessions represent. Recognition, validation, love. Your brother may see that piano as physical proof of your grandmother's favor. But that's just it. Grandmother tried to be fair. She acknowledged him in the will, left him a substantial cash inheritance. It was his own actions that damaged their relationship. Sometimes people rewrite history to protect themselves from painful truths," James said. "It's easier for him to believe she was manipulated than to accept that. His behavior drove her to these decisions." We went through the designation paperwork together, his methodical explanations grounding me back in the present task. The house would soon have the protection grandmother had wanted, a small victory in what was becoming an increasingly complex situation. As James prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Would you like to have dinner sometime? Not to, discuss paperwork or the trust. Just dinner." The invitation caught me off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. There had been a growing connection between us. Subtle glances, conversations that lingered, a sense of understanding that felt rare and valuable. "I'd like that," I said. He smiled. "Friday? I know a place downtown with excellent jazz and even better food." After he left, I returned to the scholarship applications, but my thoughts kept drifting. It had been almost 2 years since my last relationship ended, a casualty of my focus on career and my regular visits to grandmother as her health began to decline. The idea of beginning something new amidst all this family turmoil seemed complicated, yet there was also a rightness to it, as if grandmother's legacy included the possibility of joy, not just responsibility. That evening, I played the piano longer than usual, working through a piece I'd been composing sporadically since her death. It had started as an elegy, but was evolving into something more complex, moments of sorrow giving way to passages of unexpected lightness, like sunshine breaking through clouds. Around 11, as I was preparing for bed, my phone rang. Melissa's number. "Emily," her voice was tight with tension. "Nate's been drinking all day. He left about an hour ago and he took his spare key to your grandmother's house. I think he's coming for the piano." My heart raced. "Did you call the police?" "Yes, but they said they can't do anything until he actually trespasses or causes damage. I thought you should know. Be careful. He's not himself lately." I thanked her and hung up, immediately checking that all the doors and windows were locked. For good measure, I wedged a chair under the front doorknob, an old trick grandmother had taught me during a tornado scare when I was 10. Just after midnight, I heard a car door slam outside. Through the parlor window, I saw Nathaniel's Mercedes parked haphazardly at the curb. He staggered slightly as he approached the front steps, confirming Melissa's warning about his drinking. I watched from the darkened interior as he fumbled with his key at the front door, then cursed loudly when the chair prevented it from opening. He moved to the side of the house, trying the kitchen entrance, rattling windows as he went. My phone was in my hand, 911 ready to dial, when I suddenly stopped. Through the kitchen window, I could see him standing in the backyard, staring up at the house, at the lit window of what had been his childhood bedroom. For a long moment, he remained motionless. Then his shoulders slumped, and he sank onto the garden bench where grandmother had sat on summer evenings to listen to the neighborhood sounds. Something about his dejection, the proud, brother I'd known reduced to this lonely figure in the midnight garden, moved me in a way his anger never could. I unlocked the kitchen door and stepped onto the back porch. "Nate," I called softly. He looked up, his face half illuminated by moonlight. "Come to call the cops on me?" "No." I stepped closer. "Though I probably should." "Probably." He laughed humorlessly. "Everyone else has given up. On me. Why not you too?" I sat beside him on the bench, keeping a cautious distance. The February air was cold, but neither of us moved to go inside. Above us, stars punctuated the Nashville sky, the same stars we'd named and claimed as children, lying on this very lawn during summer campouts. "What happened to us?" I asked finally. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. "I don't know," he said eventually. "Somewhere along the way, I started believing that success meant certain things: money, status, control. I thought I was building something important. And now? Now I've lost it all anyway." He looked at me directly for the first time. "I'm not here for the piano, not really. I needed to be here in this place. One more time. This will always be your home." "Too, Nate." He shook his head. "No, I gave up that right." He stood, suddenly looking very sober and very tired. "I'm leaving Nashville. Starting over somewhere. The divorce will be final soon. Nothing left for me here." "Where will you go?" "West, maybe. Colorado or California. Somewhere I can see the horizon." He took a step toward the gate, then turned back. "I won't contest the will again. I won't bother you anymore. Just take care of her piano." It was the heart of this house. I watched him walk to his car, shoulders straight despite everything, still recognizably the brother I'd looked up to as a child. As his taillights disappeared down the street, I remained in the garden, surrounded by the ghostly outlines of grandmother's dormant rose bushes, waiting for the spring that would eventually come. Spring arrived in Nashville with characteristic exuberance, dogwoods and redbuds blooming along the streets, azaleas bursting into color in gardens throughout the city. I returned to teaching as scheduled, balancing my course load with the ongoing work of the Parker Trust. The first scholarships had been awarded to 5 promising young musicians, and plans were underway for a summer concert series in grandmother's garden. The historic designation had been finalized in March, ensuring the property would maintain its architectural integrity for generations to come. James had been instrumental throughout the process, his expertise navigating the complexities of preservation law proving invaluable. Our professional relationship had evolved alongside a personal one: dinners that lingered into the late evening, walks through Nashville's historic districts, conversations that ranged from literature to music to our shared vision for community spaces. I had heard nothing from Nathaniel since that night in February. According to Melissa, who had finalized her divorce and accepted a position with a real estate firm in Atlanta, he had indeed moved west to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he was working for a small architectural restoration company. The irony wasn't lost on me, though I wondered if perhaps it represented some form of atonement. One April afternoon, I returned home from campus to find a package on the porch. A flat, rectangular parcel wrapped in brown paper and addressed in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a framed photograph I had never seen before. Grandmother at the Steinway, perhaps in her 40s, head thrown back in laughter as her fingers rested on the keys. A note accompanied it. Found this while cleaning out my studio. Thought you should have it. N. I hung the photograph in the music room. A silent acknowledgement of the fragile peace that had formed between us. Not forgiveness exactly, but a mutual stepping back from the battlefield. Of inheritance. The house had changed subtly over the months since grandmother's passing. While I'd preserved her essential spaces, the music room remained untouched, her study maintained its dignified character. Other areas had evolved to accommodate new purposes. The formal dining room now housed a small library of musical scores and educational materials. The sunroom had been transformed into a meeting space for the Trust's board of directors, who gathered monthly to review applications and plan initiatives. James and I had discussed the possibility of my moving permanently into the house, a prospect that both excited and intimidated me. My small campus apartment had always been sufficient, but as the Trust's activities expanded, it made practical sense for me to be on site. Beyond practicality, though, was the growing sense that this was where I belonged, not just as grandmother's heir, but as the natural continuation of her vision. On a perfect May evening, the first official event of the Parker Music Trust took place. A garden concert featuring the scholarship recipients performing alongside members of the Nashville Symphony. We'd set up chairs on the lawn, strung fairy, lights through the ancient oak trees, and positioned the Steinway, carefully transported by specialists, on the stone patio where it gleamed in the golden light of late afternoon. Nearly 100 people attended, neighbors, colleagues, students, music lovers from across the city. As I welcomed them, standing beside the piano that had started this entire journey, I felt grandmother's presence more strongly than I had since her death. Music has always lived in this house, I told the assembled guests. For 4 generations, these walls have absorbed melodies, harmonies, the vibrations of strings and voices. My grandmother believed that music wasn't meant to be hoarded but shared, that its true value lay in its ability to build bridges between people, between past and future, between what is and what could be. I glanced at James, who stood at the edge of the crowd, his encouraging smile strengthening my voice. The Parker Music Trust exists to continue that tradition, to ensure that talented young musicians have the support they need, that our community has spaces where music can be experienced by everyone, that the conversation between generations continues through the universal language of melody and rhythm. The concert that followed was everything I had hoped for. Joyful, moving, a perfect blend of classical traditions and fresh interpretations. The final piece featured all 5 scholarship recipients performing an arrangement of a folk melody grandmother had often played, its familiar notes rising into the twilight sky as fireflies began to illuminate the garden. Later, after the guests had departed and the musicians had carefully packed away their instruments, James and I sat alone by the piano in the quiet garden. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said, his hand finding mine in the darkness. "This is exactly what she envisioned." "I think so too," I replied, feeling the weight of the evening's success, the rightness of what we had created. It's strange. When she first passed, I saw the trust as a responsibility, almost a burden. Now I understand it was actually a gift. Not just the house or the piano, but the purpose behind them. "And what about you? Are you finding your own purpose in all this?" I considered his question, looking out over the garden where moonlight silvered the path grandmother had walked thousands of times. "I think I'm beginning to. Teaching has always been my calling, but this, creating spaces where music and community intersect, feels like an extension of that, not a departure." "And us?" he asked quietly. "Where do we fit in this vision?" We had been careful these past months, taking our time, allowing our relationship to develop naturally alongside our professional collaboration. Yet there was no denying the deepening connection between us, a harmony that felt increasingly essential to my life's composition. "I think," I said slowly, "that grandmother would say we're creating our own music now, something new that honors the past without being constrained by it." He smiled, understanding the reference to our first meeting at the piano. A duet, then. Something like that. The following week brought an unexpected email, a brief message from Nathaniel with an attachment. Cleaning out some old files, found this recording of grandmother playing at my 5th birthday party. Thought the trust might want it for the archives. I opened the audio file with trembling fingers, and suddenly, grandmother's playing filled my office. A joyful rendition of Happy Birthday that transformed halfway, through into an impromptu jazz arrangement punctuated by the delighted giggles of what must have been a young Nathaniel. I listened 3 times before responding. Thank you, this means more than you know. How are you settling in Santa Fe? His reply came the next day, longer, more detailed than I had expected. He described his new job restoring historic adobe buildings, a small apartment with a view of distant mountains, evening classes in architectural design. No mention of the will, the piano, or our midnight conversation in the garden. Instead, a cautious recounting of a life being rebuilt, brick by brick. The restoration work is teaching me patience, he wrote. You can't rush these old structures. You have to listen to what they need, respect what they've endured. Sometimes the most damaged places require the most careful handling. I understood the subtext, the tentative reaching across the gulf between us. Not an apology exactly. Nathaniel had always found those difficult, but an acknowledgement of damage done and the possibility of repair. I printed his email, placing it in the growing archive of family documents I was assembling in grandmother's study. Someday, perhaps, the full story would be told, not just of the inheritance drama, but of the slow, painful process of reconciliation that followed. For now, it was enough to know that healing had begun, however fragile and incomplete. That evening, as sunset painted the Nashville sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold, I sat at the Steinway, playing the piece I had been composing since grandmother's death. It had evolved over the months from elegy to something more complex, a musical narrative that incorporated grief and loss, but allowed room for renewal, for unexpected joy, for the future that was unfolding note by note beneath my fingers. Outside, spring deepened toward summer. Inside, surrounded by the legacy of 4 generations, I played on, adding my own voice to the ongoing conversation between past and future that resonated through the very foundations of the house that music had built. 2 years passed, seasons cycling through Nashville's distinctive rhythms, humid summers giving way to crisp autumns, brief winters yielding to explosive springs. The Parker Music Trust had flourished beyond my initial hopes, expanding from scholarships and concerts to educational programs in underserved schools, master classes with visiting musicians, and community workshops that brought together people from all walks of life. The house itself had evolved, maintaining its historic character while adapting to its new purpose. The formal parlor now hosted intimate recitals. The library had been expanded to include a digital archive of Nashville's musical heritage, and the garden had been restored, according to grandmother's original plans, with spaces specifically designed for outdoor performances. I had officially moved in a year earlier, after James and I married in a simple ceremony beneath the oak trees, with music provided by the Trust's first class of scholarship recipients. My academic career continued. I had recently been granted tenure at Vanderbilt, but the balance of my professional life had shifted to include the Trust's growing activities. On a bright October morning, remarkably similar to the day of grandmother's funeral 3 years earlier, I sat in the music room reviewing applications for the coming year's scholarships. The Steinway gleamed in the autumn sunlight, its polished surface reflecting the changing leaves outside the bay windows. I had just finished a practice session, working through a challenging Rachmaninoff piece I planned to perform at the Trust's anniversary concert. The doorbell rang, an unusual occurrence on a weekday morning when most of Nashville was at work or school. I opened the front door to find a delivery man holding a large rectangular package. "Delivery for Emily Parker Sullivan," he announced, consulting his clipboard. I signed for the mysterious parcel and carried it to the music room, curious about its contents and sender. The return address was from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Nathaniel. Our communication over the past 2 years had been sparse but gradually warming. Occasional emails, birthday cards, brief updates about life changes. He had started his own architectural preservation firm, specializing in historically significant buildings in the Southwest. He was dating a museum curator. He had adopted a shelter dog named Mozart, a coincidence that had made me smile when he mentioned it. I opened the package carefully, removing layers of protective bubble wrap to reveal a framed document, the original deed to grandmother's house dated 1887, signed by my great-great-grandfather. I had known of its existence but thought it lost decades ago. Attached was a note in Nathaniel's neat architect's handwriting. Emily found this in an antique store in Taos, of all places. The owner had no idea of its significance. Just another old paper in a box of estate sale items. Some things find their way home eventually, I suppose. I'll be in Nashville next month for a preservation conference. Would like to see the house if that's all right. See what you've done with the place. Nate. I traced the faded signature on the deed, marveling at the journey this document had taken and what its return symbolized. I immediately emailed Nathaniel. The deed arrived safely. It's perfect for the archive. And yes, the house would love to see you. So would I. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity as we prepared for both the anniversary concert and Nathaniel's visit. James, always sensitive to the complexities of family relationships, suggested we invite Nathaniel to stay with us, rather than at a hotel, a gesture of reconciliation that felt both terrifying and necessary. To my surprise, Nathaniel accepted. The day of his arrival coincided with final preparations for the concert. The garden was being transformed with a small stage, seating for 200 guests, and strings of lights that would illuminate the evening performance. Inside, the house hummed with activity, caterers in the kitchen, sound technicians checking acoustics, trust volunteers arranging program booklets. I was reviewing last-minute details with our events coordinator when a taxi pulled up outside. Through the front window, I watched Nathaniel emerge. Older, more weathered than I remembered, his once perfectly coiffed hair now streaked with gray and slightly longer. He paid the driver, shouldered his bag, and stood for a long moment staring up at the house, his expression unreadable from a distance. I met him at the door, our greeting awkward but not cold, a handshake that evolved into a brief, hesitant hug. "You look well," he said, stepping into the foyer, his eyes taking in the subtle changes to the space. "So do you. New Mexico agrees with you." He nodded. "The light there, it's different. Clearer somehow." I showed him to the guest room, our old playroom converted into a comfortable space for visiting musicians and trust associates. He set down his bag and followed me on a tour of the house, commenting professionally on the preservation work, noting with approval how we had balanced historical accuracy with functional adaptations. When we reached the music room, he paused, his gaze fixing on the Steinway. "You've maintained it beautifully," he said, running a hand lightly along its edge. The same gesture grandmother had often made, I realized with a start. "It's still the heart of the house," I said, echoing his words from that night in the garden. He nodded, understanding the reference. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the bench. I stepped back, watching as he sat and positioned his hands over the keys. Nathaniel had never been musical, had rejected grandmother's attempts to teach him as a child, but now he placed his fingers with surprising confidence and began to play. Not a complex piece, but a simple, haunting melody I didn't recognize. "Something I've been working on," he explained, seeing my surprise. "I started lessons last year. Figured it was time." The piece was unpolished but heartfelt, a beginner's composition filled with emotion that technical skill couldn't yet fully articulate. When he finished, the final notes hanging in the air between us, I felt something shift, a door opening that had been locked for years. That evening, the anniversary concert unfolded beneath a perfect autumn sky. 200 guests filled the garden, including prominent Nashville musicians, educators, community leaders, and the families of scholarship recipients. From my seat in the front row, with James on one side and Nathaniel on the other, I watched as young performers took their places on the stage, the living embodiment of grandmother's vision. The final performance was mine, the composition I had been working on since her death, now complete and ready to be shared. As I approached the Steinway, positioned center stage beneath the oak trees, I glanced at Nathaniel. His expression was open, attentive, free of the bitterness that had clouded our relationship for so long. I titled the piece simply, Inheritance. It began with a solitary melodic line, grandmother's favorite hymn, then evolved into variations that incorporated elements of classical structure, jazz improvisation, and folk rhythms. The music told our story, the tensions, the conflicts, the painful separations, but also the connections that remained despite everything, the harmonies that emerged from dissonance. As I played the final movement, a gentle resolution that echoed the opening theme without simply repeating it, I felt grandmother's presence, not as a ghost, but as an ongoing influence, a voice in the continuing conversation between generations. The notes rose into the night sky, joining the stars that had witnessed our family's journey for more than a century. The applause that followed was generous, but it was Nathaniel's response that mattered most to me. The quiet nod of recognition, the understanding in his eyes as I returned to my seat. Later, after the guests had departed and the garden had been returned to its usual state, Nathaniel and I sat on the porch swing, the same swing where grandmother had told us stories on summer evenings long ago. "You've done something remarkable here," he said, gesturing toward the house. "Created something that matters." "It was her vision," I replied. "I just followed the blueprint." He smiled. "No, you've built something new from the foundation she laid. That takes courage and imagination." We talked until midnight, really talked, for the first time in years. About our childhoods, about grandmother, about the different paths we had taken and where they had led us. Not all wounds were healed. Some would always leave scars. But in the gentle rhythm of the porch swing, in the shared language of memory, we found a way to be family again. Imperfect, complicated, but connected. The next morning, before his departure for the conference, Nathaniel handed me a small package. "One more thing that belongs here," he said. Inside was grandmother's journal from the year before her death, the missing volume from the collection I had found in the storage room. "I took it after the funeral," he admitted, afraid of what she might have written about me. "Turns out she wrote mostly about you. How proud she was of the woman you'd become. How certain she was that you would carry her legacy forward." I held the journal carefully, this final piece of grandmother's story returning home. "Thank you," I said simply. After Nathaniel left, I took the journal to the music room and placed it with the others in the archive we were building. A family history that included both harmony and discord, both failure and redemption. Outside, Nashville continued its daily rhythms. Inside, surrounded by the tangible legacy of 4 generations, the house, the piano, the music that had sustained us through joy and grief, I understood finally what grandmother had been teaching me all along. That inheritance isn't just what we receive, but what we choose to preserve, transform, and pass on. I sat at the Steinway, my fingers finding the opening notes of a new composition, one that acknowledged the past, while looking toward the future, just as she had taught me. Through the windows, autumn light gilded the changing leaves, and somewhere in that golden afternoon, in the music that filled the room, I felt the circle complete itself. Greed may shout the loudest in the moment, but truth always echoes the longest.